Our second speaker is Nuria Mehrabi. As I said before, she's a senior clinician at STARTS and a clinician trainer, and has been in charge of organizing the STARTS clinical evening for the last 10 years. Nuria first trained as a medical doctor in her native Afghanistan, and later obtained a Master's of Counseling with distinction in Australia. She's herself a former refugee, with over 30 years experience in working with refugees, both overseas, in refugee camps and in different situations, and here in Australia. This includes 25 years with STARTS. Nuria is an experienced national and international conference speaker and is the author of many publications, including textbooks and several articles in refugee journals. Nuria has lectured in various universities in New South Wales and facilitated clinical workshops across Australia. And she is the editor of Refugee Trauma and Cross-Cultural Approaches sections of the AL Talks online journal. Was also formerly editor of the Interface column in Psychotherapy Australia. Her particular interest is in developing cross-cultural therapeutic interventions with refugees, especially with Muslim clients. In her current position as STARS clinician trainer, she brings clinical expertise to STARS' wide range of training programs, and she regularly delivers workshops to service providers. In that role, she has trained probably hundreds of clinicians by now, working in trauma assessment and interventions. In 2015, she was a recipient of the Australian Muslim Professional of the Year Award. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nuria, who's the title of whose presentation today is Clinical Work with Refugee Survivors of Traumatic and Prolonged Grief, Nadim's Journey. Over to you, Nuria.
All righty. Thank you very much, Jorge, for your kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks, Richard, for your very informative and enriched presentation. Before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land that we are meeting on today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal people with us tonight. So I need to share my screen. Just be with me 1 second. Thank you. Thanks. Following on from the content Richard presented, tonight I will be presenting the case of Nadim to provide insight into how refugees are exposed to severe traumatic event and multiple losses, subsequently presenting with traumatic, complex, and prolonged grief. Nadim is not his real name, and I also changed his personal details to protect his confidentiality, but I do have permission from Nadim to share his story. In this presentation, I will give you some factual information about Nadim, his family history, trauma history, presenting problems, my assessment and intervention, but also our work together, and hopefully we will have some reflection on the outcome of therapy. It's a complex case, and as layers emerge gradually over time. Nadim is 46 years old male from Syria, arrived in 2015 under refugee and humanitarian program with his wife and 2 children, a daughter and a son. We don't know the whereabouts of his elder son. He's of a Shia Muslim background, highly educated, qualified lawyer from Syria, and he speaks fluently Arabic and English. He was referred in 2016 to us by his GP because of prolonged grief reactions, and I saw him for 80 sessions. To kind of reflect on my first session with Nadim in his clinical presentation, Nadim presented as a tall, medium-built man with beard. He was well-groomed and dressed in a white shirt and a formal black pants. He looked older than his age. He was oriented to a situation in time, could speak English, so we didn't need to use an interpreter. Initially, he hardly maintained eye contact and spoke very little. When he did, I could see a deep level of sorrow and pain in his eyes. In order to engage Nadim, I used some basic Arabic words. I can't speak Arabic, but just I know some few words. In response to my gentle questioning in Arabic, he clenched both hands, nodded his head, and then his eyes drifted, and he stared on the chair in front of him, and he went silent. I sat with the silence and felt the powerful sadness that I carried. I struggled to find words to describe how I felt. Heaviness on my shoulders and tightness in my chest. I was anxious about what he was going to tell me that he was so unbearable and heavy. After several minutes of silence, he looked at me and spoke softly and said he was not well. I asked him whether he would like to tell me a bit more. He said, "It's too much," and went silent again. I sat with this silence again. Sometimes we stay in silence to allow the client to better connect with their feelings, but we also need to bring it to the space to integrate the feelings. I gently asked him whether he had any worries and concerns to share with me. Eventually, he broke his silence and said, "My daughter asked me to see you. Everything is too much. Life in Australia is too difficult." I said to him, "It sounds that life is overwhelming in Australia to you." He nodded his head again as he was agreeing with me. Then he went silent again. Then he said, "I wish I never came to Australia. I don't like living here." I said, "It must be very hard for you to leave your homeland and come to a new country and start a new life from zero all over again." He nodded, showing that he agreed with me. It felt that getting word out of his mouth was so difficult. After several intervals between short conversations in silence, Nadim asked if we could finish the session earlier as he had headaches and he wasn't feeling well. We finished the session 20 minutes earlier, but he agreed to come for next session. I made sure that he was okay and safe to go home. Although he didn't speak much in the session, but his body language, his silence, and his eyes spoke a lot about the depth of his pain. Nadim was born in the city of Aleppo, and he was only 6 years old when he lost his mother while she was giving birth to his baby sister Nadia. Nadim's father remarried and with a woman that they had 4 children and 3 boys and a girl. According to Nadim, the report that he did, the stepmom was very much abusive towards Nadim, and she was also manipulating the relationship between Nadim and his father. But at the age of 8, Nadim managed to escape to his maternal grandparents' house, where they looked after him and raised him with care and love. He went to school and university, became a qualified lawyer, and he proved to his father and also to his stepmom that he wasn't ahmaq or dumb. Ahmaq was the Arabic word that he used, that a nickname that was given to him on that time. And then later on, his grandparents died of a natural death. And Nadim, while he was studying at uni, he met his future wife, Jamila, and she was studying teaching. They got married, but the family moved to Adlib city because Jamila's family was living there. And Nadim's younger brother Nader also joined him because he didn't want to live far away from them. They had a very comfortable life in the city of Adlib until war broke. Because of their Shia Muslims, during an attack to their village, his brother was killed but he escaped to Turkey. After he left, there was another attack to their village, and which it destroyed their family home, and his family narrowly missed it. But they managed to escape with the help of an elderly uncle while they were fleeing, the bus that was taking them stopped for them to get some food. And their oldest son, Ali, went to get some food for himself and for his siblings, but he never came back. And they were on run, and the bus wasn't waiting. So it was really, really a tough decision for the mom, whether to stay or whether to go. Eventually, the uncle convinced her that it was better for them to go in with the hope that Ali will join them later. So they escaped and they reunited with Nadim. But since then, and the son was missing, has been missing, and they haven't heard from him. There was another traumatic incident happened here in Australia. 2 years, kind of some months after their arrival, Ali went with his best friend and another friend to a men's only outing, but unfortunately they had a car accident, and Ali's best friend and his other friend were killed in that car accident. This is to show you his hometown of Adlib, where he was born in this, Aleppo, and this is Adlib where he lived until they fled. So in addition to everything else, it was devastating for Nadim to see his hometown destroyed like this. This is Aleppo before and after war. And then the loss of his homeland, personal belongings, separation, and also the social status, identity, customary lifestyle. So he was deprived from all that was known and familiar to him. He was dealing with the daunting task of adaptation in a new environment. And also it became evident that Nadim was kind of experiencing cultural bereavement because longings for his homeland, and also to the place of attachment was present as well. In addition, Nadim was a devoted Muslim, but he stopped praying. He lost trust in God. God was no longer there to protect him and his family. So he stopped praying, he stopped fasting or going to the mosque. But this also created an internal conflict for him because it was against his core beliefs that he was raised with, and he had those beliefs. And by looking at this kind of the whole history or trauma history and losses of Nadim, he had also kind of disenfranchised grief and hidden sorrow because of his only loss of his primary attachment figure, his mom, and also loss of his social status and in identity, in qualification, and everything else was present as well. My assessment took place gradually as I tried to put together pieces of information that I gathered from Nadim. So my assessment was consists of formal assessment using Multicasti, Howard, and Hopkins checklist for anxiety and depression, and then but also report from Nadim and my observation in the session. As you can see it on the board, he was highly symptomatic of depression and anxiety scores. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will mainly focus on his intense grief reactions, and specifically his more pressing presentation was related to the loss of his friend on that time. And then, so he's kind of presented with symptoms like he had this kind of emptiness, and he had a hollow in his heart, the way that he described it himself. But also when he lost his friend, he totally disconnected himself from everyone else. There was no one in Australia that could help him. And also life became meaningless for him here. But also he had these images of or pictures of his friend that he's walking towards him, but then he would realize it wasn't him. Sometimes he would hear voices he would hear his laughter, his joke, and kind of his friend was very much a live person, but then he would realize he wasn't there. In few occasions, he reported that he felt that somebody knocked on the door, but he opened the door, and of course Ali wasn't there. And because Ali was the main support person for him here in Australia, and specifically helping them in settlement process, because he actually sponsored them, then if it was to do with anything with schooling of his children or anything, then he would say, oh wait, I'll call Uncle Ali, I'm sure he knows the answer. Also in few occasions, he told me that he would message him, he would leave messages to him, and he would say that just invite him for a cup of tea or coffee. And few times he had driven to his house, but he realized he's not there, he would stop coming. So he's kind of not accepting the loss, as Richard said it before. So these symptoms were present, but also he reported headaches and kind of tightness and heaviness over his shoulders without any medical reason for it. And he was feeling guilty over the death of his friend, but he would not go there, and he would stop, and then he would switch off and disconnected and dissociated in the session. He was getting panic attacks when he was seeing certain cars, and then also he was worried about his future and the future of his children, and he constantly saying, if anything happens to me, what will happen to my children? He wasn't feeling safe in Australia, and also he was thinking that he's going mad and he's losing control here. As it's stated by Aroj in Coelho, refugee experiences is a complex interaction between torture, trauma, exile, migration, and in normal life cycle. It happens in the broader context of Australian society, and is affected by national and international events. So it's an excellent way of conceptualizing all this complexity that was happening in the life of Nadeem. We've covered most of that before, but I just wanted to highlight the recovery environment. Nadeem and his family arrived in Australia that soon after we had the Martin Place siege, and then it was anti-Muslim sentiments on that time. So he wasn't feeling safe, and it was a bit of negative environment. He wasn't feeling safe in Australia. And internationally, of course, his missing son, continuity of war is in homeland, the destruction of his community, along with distressing news, was ongoing source of stress in the life of Nadeem. His protective factors were his faith, but from time to time he would question his faith, and also the love for his family. His family was also very much supportive towards him. He was highly educated, intelligent, smart, has got English mastery, and his risk factors were his missing son, and also losing the primary supportive person here in Australia, and his social isolation and disconnection from others. Therapeutic goal was difficult to obtain clear therapeutic goals from Nadeem at the beginning, but later on he identified that he wanted to find himself and regain his identity, to facilitate the process of reconciliation with his family, and to straighten and consolidate his coping mechanism. Since the loss of his friend was the pressing presentation on that time, and also to to respond to his needs and his goals, so I use Wortman and Thurman's model described in Dr. Nemara's book for working with traumatic memories or traumatic loss. So to basically build up safety in survivors' internal and interpersonal resources, to strengthen his coping mechanism, to process the traumatic death cognitively and emotionally, and to facilitate the process of grieving. So in building up safety, as we all know, The development of therapeutic relationship was the essence of my work with Nadim, and by an empathic, congruent, unconditional, non-judgmental attitude, emphasizing on confidentiality and impartiality of our service, we developed a good therapeutic relationship. And it was really important to convey a message to Nadim that I was with him, not against him, by practically showing to him my non-judgmental attitude. And also I use the word we instead of I and you, because Nadim was coming from a collective culture, and that was most culturally appropriate way to engage him collectively in togetherness and collectively. Internal safety in external environments, just helping him with some practical assistance, but also to help him to identify some resource or a person that he can go when he needed. Eventually, he was very reluctant to do so, and no one else was here in Australia for him except his friend Ali. But later on, he recognized a couple of friends that he can go in time of distress. As I mentioned before, Nadim was presenting with symptoms like dissociation or panic attacks, and he would shaking in the session sometimes. And then, he was afraid that he's going to lose control. And it was important that he had this internal safety by providing him with psychoeducation, validating, acknowledging, containing emotions, and teaching him some techniques like grounding techniques, so he was able to kind of ground himself when it's needed. And also we kind of tried to find a safe space imaginary for him if he wasn't if he didn't have anyone else around him when he was distressed. And he identified his grandparents' garden as a very safe space, and he told me that he never felt safe anywhere else except his grandparents' garden. So it was a safe place for him to go when it's needed. In regards to processing of traumatic death of his friend, numbing dissociation and guilt was the predominant theme. He often in the session would say it was my fault, but he wouldn't go further, as he would dissociate. We needed to do the trauma-related exposure, also restructuring cognitive destructive thinking to address the guilt. For example, we also identify some of his destructive automatic thoughts, such as it was my fault, I could have saved them, I'm a bad friend, I failed to protect my friends. In approaching the exposure, I asked him when he was ready, of course, if it would be easier for him if we both revisit the scene of the incidents in imagination. Nadim agreed on that. So we both visited the scene mentally. I've used this image to describe that it felt that we were going to a difficult road where the road was rough, frozen, and up the hills that made it hard to drive. But imaginary, we both sat in a 6-seater Tarago car with his friends and driving towards our destination. Nadim remembered and described in present tense the incidents. We're going on the road trip, talking and laughing when Abdul, the driver of the car, takes his hands off the wheel to change the music and playing a loud Arabic song. And then for a second, he starts singing loud and dancing while driving. This is when he loses control and crashing into a big truck. Nadim said loudly, "The truck has hit us." Ali is in the front seat of the car where it is headed by the truck. Ali is covered in blood, and Abdul is also covered in blood. Nadim is numb, don't know what had happened. He's trying to move and help his friends to get up, but he can't. He's completely frozen, and then he goes unconscious and can't remember what had happened. He wakes up in the hospital confused and not knowing what had happened, seeing his arm in a sling and multiple bruises on his face. As he speaks, it was the third time that he became emotional and started crying in the session. As we revisited this together, Nadim was able to visualize the scene of the incident and to see the context where this incident had happened. He externalized the guilt. He saw that it wasn't his fault. He wasn't the driver of the car. He had limited control over it. He was able to process the fact that he couldn't help them because he was in shock, he was injured, he had a broken arm. I explained the process of initial trauma reaction with the possibility that he had dissociated as a part of a normal reaction to this kind of trauma. In this way, Nadim was able to confront painful emotions and see the context where this traumatic incidents happened that felt guilt over it. This piece of work with Nadim opened door for working with greater deep other significant losses. Most significantly was the loss of his brother and his missing son, Ali. He never told me before that he had a missing son. There were other layers of different types of losses: early attachment loss, separation, missing person, trauma. This is an example to the layers of his grief, having to uncover one at a time, each one revealing another. In working with his grief, I sat with his pain, traveled in his journey with him. Sometimes we stopped and sometimes we walked. Sometimes we slowed down, but other times we walked faster. I stayed with his pace. We agreed we call all the people that he had lost by their first names, except for his mom, because culturally and religiously it was inappropriate to do so. He was able to connect with his feelings and express emotions, sometimes very intense, but I was able to contain those emotions and facilitate the process of grief to experience and express it, even though it evoked strong personal response in me. In working with his friend's grief, he also identified that Ali was a subsequent replacement for his brother, Nader, who he had lost many years ago. And then the loss of his brother came on board, that he never had the opportunity to grieve because the family were on the run. And after resettlement, a lot happened that in Australia that he didn't have a chance to grieve that. It was important to recognize the loss, that he not only lost his best friend, but also he lost his the practical aspects of his support here in Australia. We also talked about the change world after the death of so many loved ones and facilitate the entry into the change world, giving him some control and structure in the middle of the chaos. Although initially he was disconnected from his faith, which was a source of support and coping mechanism, as therapy progressed and space provided in therapy, he felt more connected to himself and to his loved ones. He felt connected to his faith. We revisited his Islamic beliefs. Nadim needed to readjust to circumstances while continuing to maintain his relationship to the loved ones that he had lost and to engage in new life. Initially, he stopped contacting with his friends, family, because in his own word, he said, I didn't have face to show them. But it was the first time that he went and visited them and reconnected with his family and tried to help his 3 surviving sons of his friends with different activities, like taking them with his own sons to play soccer. In processing the grief, we tried to bring some liveliness to this session despite the losses and heavy subsequent grief. For example, he spoke about good memories of his brother and friend and how much he loved his friend that he named his son Ali after him. Not until we work through the loss of his friend that he told me that he had a missing son. And maybe it was too difficult for him to talk about it. Maybe he was feeling guilty, or maybe he was blaming his wife, or could be all of the above. As it happens with the disappearance of the loved one, he had pain and anguish with moments of bursts of hope. And the grieving was chronic, right, and then healing. And also it was difficult for him to lose his first child, but because in his culture, his first child and first son is the walking stick of their parents when they are getting older. So, when initially I saw, like when he spoke about his son, he wasn't talking about him with his wife or with his children. There was no any conversation regarding I in household, and he told me that he didn't want it to distress his wife. But as we explore further, he identified the need that his wife was also in pain, in grieving, and she needed support. So I refer her to counseling to start, and she started seeing a counselor as well. As we spoke further, and we explore on the context where that this incident had happened, that because he was feeling guilty, and he also was feeling blaming his wife for disappearance of his son. We looked at the circumstances, explored further on that, and Nadim was able to attribute the guilt to the perpetrator, and to look at the circumstances, and it was ISIS who made them flee, and also if maybe Nadim and his wife hadn't lived, they would have lost their other children. So Nadim started talking to his wife because it was their shared pain, and also it was their shared loss, and that at least made some connection between the two of them. And eventually Nadim decided, and also he started connection with his father and also with his sister, because they were the one that they were looking to find his son. And then, but eventually he decided to go to Turkey, and from there to Syria to find his son's whereabouts. But his father had called him and told him that there's no need for him to go, because they had looked everywhere and they couldn't find any evidence to see where he was. And he said, and he advised him not to come because it was really dangerous for him to come to Syria. And after that conversation, he called me and he asked for a scheduled appointment. I gave him an appointment. He was very much distressed. He was sobbing, and he was sobbing, and he told me what had happened. And then I of course, I contained him and validated his feelings. And then I asked him gently, what would happen if you think your father was right? And then he said, I feel like I killed my son. And then I said to him, has he taken away your hope? And he said, yes, yes, and several times. But as therapy progressed, and he realized it was 4 years, all the investigation by Red Cross and everyone else didn't find the whereabouts of his son. And eventually his father told him to have specific prayer and ceremony for his son. Usually they do it for a person who dies, but he told him if he's alive, that will protect him. But if he's dead, the merit will go towards him. But also he told him no one has the knowledge, but only God has the knowledge. We don't know what's in our destiny, and everything happens for a reason. So he tried to spiritually connect him with his Islamic belief, and told him if his son is killed, then he's a martyr, and his own suffering will be rewarded by Allah. To just reflect on the therapeutic outcome, so it was a reduced PTSD and anxiety symptoms. You can see it on the board, and we worked through his grief and guilt and overcome dissociation. His headaches and pain over his shoulders was diminished. And it's interesting because, and that was like a kind of a culturally somatization and expression of grief, because he told me later on, which I forgot to mention it before, that he felt that he never gave his shoulder, supportive shoulder, to his brother, his friend, or his son. But as we worked through the grief, that kind of reduced. And also he felt connected to himself, to his wife, children, and family, his father, and he formed a support group for newly arrived Syrian refugees For instance, he will pick them up from the airport. He will act as an interpreter for them. He will support them in settlements and taking them to different services, specifically those who came on under a humanitarian program, and he became a qualified interpreter himself. So he reconstituted with his faith and philosophical system challenged by the losses. And also he found meaning and purpose in life. And he was thinking about studying to become a migrant agent here in Australia. In conclusion, working with Nadeem required to visit deep pain and face intense emotions, both for him and me. The therapeutic outcome was positive, but it didn't happen overnight, and it's hard to summarize 3 years of intense work only in 30 minutes. The therapeutic relationship was the essence of my work with Nadeem. Although Nadeem would take many years to really settle into new life that accommodate loss of so many, we ended our work together with renewed connections to his wife and children, his faith, his friend and family. He reported significantly reduced symptoms and renewed plans to study and work. Nadeem grieving may never fully end, but he did found some comfort in acceptances in the middle of all chaoses and losses that were happening in life. When he was discharged from therapy, he told me that working through his grief was the hardest journey that he had traveled, but he did find light at the end of the tunnel by focusing on his living children and redirecting his energy to do things for his family and community. But also he maintained continuous bond and connection to those loved ones that he had lost. People die, but relationships don't. Thank you very much. And there is some references if you want to have a look later on. Thank you.